backend workflows. So these are what you would use anytime you want to schedule some behavior in your application for a future date and time. But they're also a really handy way of consolidating behavior that might be triggered from multiple points in your application. For example, here on our main index page, I have added a little upvote icon. But of course, we also have an upvote icon here on our question page. Now, what if every time that a question is upvoted, we want to send an email to the question's creator? Well, we could have this icon and the one on the index, appearing in a reusable element and trigger that workflow within the reusable element. But that's not always going to be the convenient option. In our case, we've got sort of a different icon here, right? It's a small one. Technically, we could have that in a reusable element with a bigger one and just conditionally show and hide, one depending on what page that we're on. But a much cleaner way, and one that you're going to find yourself using quite often once you get the hang of it, is actually triggering the behavior in a backend workflow. So in our case, when this upvote button is clicked, we're going to schedule an email to the questions creator. Now, backend workflows, they actually live in a sort of a hidden part of the site. You have to unlock them, if you will. You have to come down to settings and click on API and then enable workflow API and backend workflows. And once you've done that, then you'll see an option here called a backend workflow. Scheduling a backend workflow is a lot like scheduling a custom event, in that you're going to define sort of the event parameters, what data, what values the event is going to be expecting, and then you're just going to build a string of actions just like you would in any other workflow. So we'll create what Bubble will call an endpoint. And that's because for those of you who have dabbled in APIs, other third-party services can actually trigger these workflows if you share the endpoint or the address of this workflow with them. But we can also schedule them within our application internally. So we don't need to really worry about third-party integrations just yet. So what we'll do is we'll come along and we'll schedule a new API endpoint, and we'll call it, upvote created. And we don't need to expose it as a public endpoint. That's going to allow, what I said, third-party services to use this. And these checkboxes here aren't so important for our purposes. This basically means that, a third-party service could trigger this endpoint even if they didn't provide some credentials, some special key that we use to identify them, and we've verified them ahead of time, anything like that. So anyway, we won't go down that road too much. What's important for us is this section here, add a new parameter. So that's exactly the same. If I come over to my tooltip and the custom event that we created in the last workflow, that's exactly the same as creating sort of a storage container for some data, right? So here I've got text, right? We can only have one data container with a custom event, but on endpoints, we can create any number of parameters, okay? So in our case, what we might want to take is the question, and that's because the question is going to contain a whole bunch of information for us. It's going to contain, obviously, the question itself, the user that created it, even the user who upvoted it, should we care about that. But we only care really about the user who created it. So we'll send through the question, and then what we can do is schedule an action here that's going to send an email, okay? And I'll send it to myself just for simplicity. Okay. And the sender name is Film Exchange. Obviously, we could send it to the user's email, and in fact, that's what I'll do, because the users in this app share the same email as me anyway. So the questions creator's email, okay? And the subject line can be something like, someone just upvoted your question. And then we can say, hi, someone just upvoted your question And then we can insert the question's title here, right? Let's actually put it down a line. The question's title. And, you know, just for demonstration purposes, that's probably enough. We'll bold this as well so it sticks out. So now we have this endpoint created. We just have to create a place in the application to trigger it. And of course, that's going to be in 2 separate places. On our new up icon here, okay, we will schedule an API workflow, and the one that we will choose, of course, is the only one that we have this upvote created. Now we can schedule it for any time that we want, but since we're using this as sort of an extension of the existing, you know, contemporary workflow here, we're just going to do it for the current date or time, which is basically going to mean it's going to be scheduled immediately. And the question is going to be the parent group's question, that parent group being the one that's being pulled through from the cell. Now, you'll also notice that I don't have the other upvote functionality here in this workflow. The functionality that actually adds a user to a list of a question's votes. Now, rather than copying this and adding it to the index page, right, and pasting it here, and violating the do not repeat yourself principle, since we've got it existing both here and on the question page, a better thing to do would just be to add it to this API workflow itself. I can right click on it and go edit workflow. That's a fast way to get to it. Insert an action. In fact, I don't even need to insert an action. I right click paste because I've got this action on my clipboard of sorts. Okay, we're making changes to a question. Okay, and the votes field of that question is then going to have the current user added just as before. We just need to make sure that we're only doing this when the current user is logged in. That's the condition that we had before. So current user is logged in. And now we can actually, on this upvote button on the question page, we can remove the existing action and schedule our API workflow here as well, exactly the same as before. Current page's question. So now we've got this one trigger action here on the question page. We've got another trigger action here on the index page, and we've consolidated all of the related actions, adding a user to a questions list of votes and sending an email to the questions creator, all within one workflow. So a really clean setup. In the future, if we wanted to make changes to this user experience or to this behavior, we just have to come to one place in the application, which is to this API workflow, and make all of the changes to that one workflow rather than making changes in multiple places in the app. So let's see if this is actually working now. I will preview my index page. Okay, I've got here a question, how did the cars get inverted in tenant? I can click that. And sure enough, there the votes go up. Now, since we're scheduling this API workflow on the server, it's usually not quite as fast as changing some data here on the page. But for simple tasks, I mean, that was basically instant. We didn't really need to worry about it too much. And then if we come onto another question and decide we want to upvote from the question page itself, that also proves to not be a problem. So that's back-end workflows. They're a really powerful part of Bubble, one that you should really get into the habit of using. And the reason why they're so powerful, as you've seen, is because you can consolidate actions that might otherwise live across all different parts of your app into one workflow that exists in one part of your application. The other advantage is that running a back-end workflow isn't going to slow down the page. So if you've got this complex sequence of actions, make a change to this data type, then make a change to another data type, then use the result of step 3 to make a change to a third data type. You've got all of these things happening sequentially that the user might otherwise be sitting on the page waiting for. when you can, it's really good to move all of those actions to a backend workflow so that the only time the user is waiting is while that backend workflow is actually being triggered. And then essentially all of that work is being offloaded to the server to be happening concurrently or asynchronously while the user continues to go about their business in your application.